There, 4 o'clock, we'll open the meeting. Do we have any need to go into executive session tonight, or this afternoon, for any
I
reason?
don't, Chief, but...
No, we can let that pass at this point.
Okay.
Do we need to amend the agenda?
No, it actually has been revised from the
So-
original Friday agenda. We posted the revision Monday. It's just to add a listers and a...
So we do need to amend it to add the,
If you want to confirm that we have a revised agenda.
we do have a revised
Sure.
one for the listers omissions.
Yep.
Can I have a motion to
So
accept
moved.
that?
Second.
Motion been made second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Ayes have it. Do we have any remarks from any of the board members before we get going? Hearing none?
Not for this
No,
meeting.
not for this meeting. Good. I'm sure. Do we have any public comment right now before we get started? Hearing none? We will go right into new business. The discussion of the future of our listers.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the select board's had multiple discussions about this because of the untimely resignation of a couple of our listers. In fact, all three have resigned in this past year, and recruitment of qualified replacement candidates has been difficult. And with that in mind, as you know, the town has retained a professional assessor to help that office. And since that time, we've also taken on another consultant who has listing experience here in Pittsford by the name of Donna Wilson. And so that's all to the good. However, the board, I think, still wants to know what legal options the town has if it wishes to go in a different direction than sort of a cobbled together department like we have now. And so we have hired Carl Andier from the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. He's in their legal department, and he's here to tell us about the town's options going forward. Sound right, Carl?
So, I guess the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I believe you were going to do one of the lights and make it a
Oh,
little
yes.
easier.
I can do that.
Yeah, so it's not so much glare. Great, so you have the pack outs. I've handed these out as well, so you can follow along the screen and you have the information to take on with you. So anyway, thanks for that. My name is Carl Andier. I'm from Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Are you all familiar? You've all heard of VLCT?
Oh, yeah.
Before? Okay. So I won't talk much about us then. So we have select board members here, obviously, town manager, and
I'm the recording secretary.
And we have several members from the
and then
lister's office.
Great.
And some guy who came in off the street.
Yeah. A citizen at large.
Yeah, so it's just nice to know the audience. As you know, obviously you're here to talk about what options the town has for, whether it's the office of the listers, often called board of listers, or whether there's going to be help of someone else, or whether it's just going to be a single assessor. That is an option. And so I'm going to kind of go through 4 different main options that the town has in terms of how it wants its lister office to be, or how it wants, if it wants to have a single assessor or whatnot. And the first one that I'm going to be talking about is that the select board can authorize or basically hire help, expert assistance for the office of listers. And it sounds like it's kind of done that already, and that's something the town can do. Another option too is that the select board can, if the select board can't find listers to fill vacancies, like under law, many offices are filled the same way, which is the select board fills it by appointing someone who's a registered voter, because the office of the lister is an elected position, and then that person fills the vacancy until the next election is had. But the law also says if the select board can't find people to fill the office of a lister, and that has happened, towns have called and say no one wants to be a lister. What do we do? The select board then can say, all right, as a stopgap, we're going to appoint, essentially hire an assessor who will take the shoes of a lister, and that way we can at least have a majority of people, 2 out of 3 in that office to perform things that they have to do, appraise properties. The third option we're going to cover is that the town can ultimately at a town meeting, annual town meeting, eliminate listers, the office entirely, and then the select board would have to contract or hire a professional assessor. And that single person would then take all of the duties of the 3 listers. And then finally, if the town wants a kind of a longer process that would be more tailored, the town can adopt a governance chart. I don't believe you have one
We do not have a
already.
charter
So
now.
you have to you adopt one, and so adopting it, you would be saying, look, those are the 3 options that we have generally under state law, but we want to have our own kind of tailored office of listers or assessors, and that can be kind of whatever you want it to be. And that would be through a town vote, and then with the Vermont legislature approving that governance charter. So I'm gonna go over those 4, and I have this little thing here. Really simplifies all of those, so there's a lot more nuance, as you know. I'm gonna go through it, but so basically I'm gonna go through and you'll see like the 4 options, reflect the 4 options on the screen, and so as you go along, you can just know that option 1 will be the blue one, option 2 will be red, and so on.
You want to hold that up toward?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
So if you have questions, obviously feel free to ask me as I go along. If I'm gonna get to it later, I'll just say, hold on, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so this is in your packet, but what it is, it is a recognition that lister's job is pretty difficult. It used to be that I think it was a lot more, I wasn't around, but I've been told and read that it was a lot easier to do appraisals for towns and properties. But that's changed dramatically in the last 20 years. There's all these things that listers have to be aware of when they're appraising properties. So many different kinds of appraisal methods. They have to be aware of the town zoning regulations, what kind of property it is. You know, is Act 250 going to affect it? Is it in current land use? They have to analyze all this information and data. So it's just a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time and resources. So I think it's just important to know that that's a fact, and to recognize that it's not an easy job. And so it makes sense that you're asking for these options. And many towns are kind of wondering, like, how can we help our listers out? What can we do? And so to move on, before we talk about the options, I'll just talk about like default state law, and that's what your town follows. Except that you've already hired a little help, but that's fine. So under Vermont law, there's a board of listers. There's 3 of them. They're elected at town meeting, so they're registered voters of the town because they're residents of the town. And they perform all those options that listers have to do, right? Appraise the property every year, and then lodge a grand list or the abstract, and then have grievance hearings. And they're also on the board of abatement in the town. Because it's 3 listers, you need to have 2. There needs to be 2 of them in office, and 2 of them deciding and in agreement. Because there's a state law that says when there's a body of 3 or more, you have to have a majority of those members be in agreement to take any action. So this is, where, I think one reason I'm here is that, obviously, as we've said many times, the town is having trouble figuring out and getting people to fill that position. So like I already mentioned, typically under state law, if you have 3 listers in a town and 1 resigns, the select board, it says in the law, you have to post a notice within 10 days of the vacancy, and then it says the select board shall forthwith appoint someone to fill that vacancy. And we don't have a definition for what forthwith is, but it really means basically as soon as possible. And so towns will call and say, a lister resigned or another office has resigned, and how soon do we have to appoint? And we say, well, as soon as you can. We say, well, no one wants to fill the position. And we say, just you got to keep trying to fill the position because it says you have to under state law. So that's kind of how it typically works with the Office of the Listers. However, if you can't fill the positions, or if there might be some resignations and you're having trouble filling it, or you want to restructure it, we'll go into those options right now. One of those being that you can have assistants for the listers. And the law says when the listers, usually in consultation, right, with the select board, think that assistant is needed, they can, select board can basically go ahead and hire help for the listers. And you know, the way it's written, it's pretty broad to say that, look, we can have expert assistants come in and help the listers appraise a single complicated property, or maybe there's a reappraisal year and we need to have a few people come in and help with this giant reappraisal. By the way, when did you guys had your reappraisal recently?
Yes, a couple of years ago.
Okay,
Yeah.
nice. Well, that's a relief. Hopefully you don't have to do it for
Not
a
for a
while.
while.
So this is kind of like just the if you have listers and there's no need to immediately fill a position, but the listers do need help, then this is the kind of that option is what you want to do, is by just having the select board hire expert assistants to assist the listers. Like I said, the select board has the authority to just do it themselves, or the law says, if you go back, it says, or by vote of town. So there could be a separate ballot. You know, the select board's not sure they want to spend the money. The select board could put it on the town meeting warning. And here's an example of what that could be. You know, shall the voters of the town authorize to employ the assistance of expert assessors, you know, maybe one or more, to support the listers with tax appraisals. So that's just like an example we could use, but it doesn't have to be by town vote. Let's see. So the authority, so a hired assessor under this option here does not fill, let's say you have two listers and the select board hires an assistant to the select listers under 4041. That person doesn't take the place of a lister in the board of listers. There's still a vacancy. Okay, so and their job is to assist appraisals and provide information to the listers. But ultimately, the listers in the board of listers are the ones that are going to be finalizing and approving, right, any work that this assistant has done. So that's pretty important to know. Their authority is limited in that respect. The other thing to know, and the same thing works for grievances. So listers have grievances, right? People are upset with the appraised value of their property, so they grieve to the listers, which is the first kind of step in the tax appeal process. And in that respect, the same with the other work, the hired assistants can't, doesn't fill the lister's role there either. So they can attend the grievance, right, and help and answer questions for the listers or be there as an aid, but they're not the ones that are deciding ultimately the result of the grievances. All right, so moving on, we have appointment, and again, this is appointment of a temporary assessor. This isn't what I talked about before, which is that when there's a vacancy, that the select board has to post a notice and appoint a registered voter, right, who fills the position until the next election. This is when there is one lister, so the select board is unable, there's two vacancies, and the select board is unable to find another person to have at least two listers so that they can at least perform their work. Because remember, you need to have two. So if the select board has tried and no one wants to be appointed who's a registered voter, the select board can say, look, we've done our due diligence in good faith, we've tried to find someone to appoint to this position, but there's one lister and the town needs to get its abstract, you know, lodged, and we need to have the appraisals done. So as a stopgap, we're going to appoint an assessor to fill the shoes of a lister. And so this person doesn't need to be a resident of the town, and they do take the shoes of a lister. They have the same function and authority and obligations that a lister would have, okay? And that person only stays on until the next town meeting. So it's really just a limited, for that year, that tax year, stopgap action. Okay. So they would do all the, so if there's, one lister and you appoint an assessor as a necessity, that assessor and that lister then, are the board of listers that would make all those decisions. Third option, any questions so far? Making sense? Okay. Third option, so this would be the green one on that grid. The town can vote to eliminate the office, office of lister or the board of listers, at an annual meeting. So you see, if the town votes to eliminate the office of lister, the select board shall contract with or employ a professionally qualified assessor who need not be a resident. So the difference between, I'll look at that in a second. So here's an example of how that vote, how that ballot would be on the town meeting warning. Do you vote by Australian ballot for anything?
Just the budget,
Just
just
the
the
budget.
school budget
School budget.
and the officers.
The election of the officers, but, so yeah, so this wouldn't be by Australian ballot because this is a public question and you'd have to, if you wanted it by Australian ballot, you'd have to have a town meeting to say you want public questions by Australian ballot, and then at the next town meeting, then you could have this by Australian ballot. But you don't do that now, so this wouldn't be by Australian ballot, but the law does say it has to be by paper ballot, which would just be like if you're having your floor meeting, you would just have to have like a paper ballot where you're voting.
Yes or no type.
Yeah, yes or no type within the area of the town meeting. It's funny, there's a few random votes that have to be by paper ballot, not Australian ballot during the election.
Yeah.
I don't know why they did it like that, but it's just how they did it. So it's a long example, but this is the one that we made up a while ago, and that we think would fit the requirement to eliminate the entire office and allow the select board to just hire a contract with a single professional assessor. And so the main difference here for the other ones is that the select board has to then hire someone, and the other main difference is that it's a single person who fills the role of previously that was 3 people.
Can it be a corporation, like a company like Nemrick, for example?
Yeah, towns do that. Yeah, so I think, the single person would probably just be one of, the people there.
Our contact there.
Yeah, the contact there, that would be fine. So one thing to note on this, and that relates to the other things, is that the, let's see, so another thing to note about this is that if the town votes to do this, and it's approved at let's say this coming town meeting, for example, the people who are currently elected as listers, whose term hasn't expired, would expire 45 days after town meeting. So if the people said, yes to this, 45 days after town meeting, the office, all the people who are currently elected as listers would automatically, essentially, that office would be revoked and would no longer exist by operation of law, because that's what the law says. So to kind of make it a little bit cleaner, at your town meeting, if you're going to have this vote, you'd probably want to do it before you had election of officers. Oh, you do that by Australian ballot.
That's by ballot.
So, but that's okay. You can still have your Australian ballot you can put on elect town listers in case this failed at your floor meeting. Because either way, if people were elected listers by Australian ballot and this also passed, then it would still, 45 days later, those people the office would be rejected. It could be earlier than 45 days if the select board hires that single professional assessor before 45 days. So let's say 30 days after town meeting, the select board hires someone to take that position. Then at that point, the office, all those who are listers would also be revoked as well. And then the town this would continue year to year unless the town said, nope, we're gonna reverse it. So the town could, 3 years from now, or a year from now, or 5 years from now, say, actually, we want the office of listers back. We're gonna have a vote to rescind this, this single assessor. And then the other thing to note is that if that town votes to do that, you don't have a governance charter, but if you did, and in that charter it said, the town shall elect office of listers in this method. A lot of towns have different charters that specify listers' authority and say that they're elected, just because towns have lots of charters. And if a charter had that, then you couldn't actually use this authority, because the fact that you have a charter under the law says that you can't then vote to eliminate it because your charter says that you already have it. So, it's just to know. They talked about that they take the authority, right, of the single person takes the authority of the 3 listers. Is that right? They have the same powers to charge, same duties, and same liabilities as the board of listers. The last note on this, so at the end of this, there's a link to several resources from the State Department of Taxes Property Valuation Review. And one of the links is to their their qualified list of certified assessors and appraisers, I think it's called, something like that. And it's a long list, and I'm almost positive Nemrick is on it. They have to be. And that is essentially a list that the town has to use to say, okay, if we're going to have a qualified professional assessor, it needs to be someone from that list. Because there's a law that says that no person, company, or firm. Let's see if it is in here somewhere. It says, no person, firm, or corporation shall be employed by a municipality to perform appraisals of real property for the purpose of property taxation unless approved by the director of property valuation and review as qualified under this section. So they have a list of qualified vendors, and it's a long list. So I don't think there's a worry of not having options there that the town has to choose from.
Is that a licensed position?
Yeah, it's some certification that they have. I don't know the requirements of it in particular. I just know that, I don't know how hard it is to get on that or what, but you can probably call them and ask them. The website will also have, I think they have a link on the end of my presentation here. If you go to Municipal Officials Resources, within that link there should be like the link to certification and how to get certification. Okay, so last option, this is just kind of throwing it out there because it's an option. The town can adopt a charter and have its own, build its office of appraisers or listers, however it wants to, essentially, as long as the town approves it by town vote and as long as the legislature doesn't think it's too crazy or something. They usually approve people's charters that they've proposed. So I just put a couple examples. There's a lot of text here, but just an example. St. Albans has a governance charter provision right here. The top one, if you read, it really isn't, if you read it, it essentially just reaffirms what listers already do under state law. Except it's one person, assessor, right? So, and that person shall be qualified. So here they've kind of, instead of having a town vote to say we're going to have a single assessor, they just put it in the governance charter, and that's how the appraisals happen in town. So it's a single person. So that's not that much different than the last option. It's just by governance charter. Brattleboro is a little bit interesting. I haven't seen this one very often. theirs says that, as an example, they have an office of assessment headed by a professional assessor, known as a town assessor, who is appointed by the town manager. So you have a single person, which is different than 3 listers, and then you have that person appointed by the town manager, which is, that's a little bit different than in state law. And then they also have, though, under the charter, a board of listers elected by the town vote, but they don't appraise, but they function as a board of appeals. So they're like,
BCA,
no, I think
like the BCA.
yeah, I think they would be like the grievance. They would hear grievances. Perhaps I haven't looked into it that much, but yeah, they either function as it's like one assessor, and then there's the listers who either hear the grievances, and then you have the BCA, or they would also be the BCA. I'm not sure. But.
Bennington used to have that model, actually.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if they still do.
Yeah, so that's a little bit different. It kind of, I can see that the value of that would be because, under state law, listers do the valuation, and then they also kind of sit in judgment of their own evaluation initially. I mean, there's a second check there with the BCA, which makes it okay, but this makes a little bit more sense. You have one person assessing, and then you have this board who says yes or no to that, so before going to the BCA, so there's kind of 2 levels of check, I think. So those are just examples I threw out. There's not that many governance charters who modify state law. If towns have a modification to how the listers work, it's usually they just say that there's one single assessor, kind of like that option that the town can have to vote. But yeah. So really, with a charter, you can make it however you want to. There's a lot of different options there. And then I didn't really get into to adopt a charter requires kind of a longer process. There has to be a proposal, and then there's a few select board hearings, public hearings on the proposed charter that have to happen kind of well in advance of any vote, and then it's warned at a special hearing.
You wouldn't have a charter just with a provision about listers. You'd have a whole
No.
constitution to
You
govern
could.
the town.
Yeah, you could. Some towns' charters are really small, and I think some town charters just have kind of, as an example, usually have some standard clauses that say, this town of Pittsford shall have all in the same authority as state law and subject to all obligations, blah, blah, blah. Essentially says, we have our charter, but at the same time, we're not losing or gaining any other authority from state law. They'll have those standard provisions, and then they'll have like one other provision for the reason why they had their charter adopted, which was maybe to modify their office of listers, or maybe a lot of towns have adopted governance charters just because they wanted to get local option tax, and that's the only way we can do it.
Okay.
So, and I can give you more detail about how you adopt a charter if you want, but it's pretty complicated and nuanced on its own, right? So I didn't want to get into that. So here, those list of resources, like I said. Lister handbook is great, and Department of Taxes, PBR, has a great, all this information in forms for listers and towns for taxes. They also have, they try to train a lot. They do a lot of trainings for listers, and all those scheduled dates and everything are on their website for when they do those trainings. And that's it. Unless, questions or?
I think one of the main concerns we had was, as you discovered toward the end, the possibility of having candidates come forward who wish to be listers and having them on the ballot, while at the same time having an article abolishing the lister's office. Hard for us to get our heads around that, but
Yeah.
that would be up to the voters to pass on that in a paper ballot. They can still, at the following day at the election on the Australian ballot, vote for lister candidates. But if what if the paper ballot the night before has abolished the listers? Would we continue with the lister election? Or would we have it on a separate ballot sheet and just
Yeah,
destroy it?
You have to.
I think you would have to do it because it was more.
Right.
45
But
days.
because
Yeah.
there's that,
Yeah.
thankfully there's that provision, they didn't
Yep.
add this, for a while, but they did later on. There is that specific law that says, if this vote is a yes,
Then
all those who are in
elected.
the office either
abolished in
because
45
they're
days.
still in their term, or they just
Right.
got elected, their
Yeah.
office is revoked after 45 days. So that
Or
is,
sooner if there's an early
or sooner
appointment
if the
by an
select board
assessor.
says, okay, we found our single assessor that we want. Yeah, well, yeah, so I guess that is a little bit more confusing. So you have your floor vote
The night before.
The
The night
night before, and
before,
then you
yeah.
have your Australian ballot. I
The
guess,
next
yeah.
day.
So it would still, that's a good question, but no, yeah, it wouldn't change. the-
You'd go forward with
Yeah.
that balloting, okay.
Yeah, I don't think you would want to, yeah. There might be a way to say, oh, we voted yes, so let's not have that question. I think it
I don't think you can.
because you
It's
warned it
warned.
that way. and-
Yeah, you've warned it, you gotta,
Yeah,
That's
there,
right.
there would be, might be issues with the procedure
Yeah.
if you did it that way, I think. Yeah.
Joe, you had a question?
It seems to me, what information I've picked up, that a lot of towns in the state, and you probably would have a better idea than I do, have made changes in the way they're doing listing. And is it mainly because of the lack of interest from residents? It's not as easy a job as it used to be, and you mentioned that, and the fact is that if you hire a professional,
Yeah.
so hopefully you'll get yourself out of any problems, or it'll make it simpler and easier.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Do you have any idea, are half of the towns in the state gone this route?
Yeah.
Or is still going the old route?
I don't know in terms of how many people have had, for example, either have a charter that says we have a single assessor, or that have had this vote to eliminate the office. I don't know how many that is. I don't know if that many have voted to eliminate. I would say more have their own. I would say there's probably more governance charters kind of saying here's how we want it to be structured, different than state law, versus people that have voted to eliminate. Probably because the law that allows you to vote to eliminate the listers hasn't been around that long. But I think a lot of towns, I would say almost all of them, at some point, especially during the reappraisal year, or building up to a reappraisal year, definitely have hired expert assistants
Right.
to support the listers,
Right.
because there's just too much work, so much information and work.
It's
Um,
more complicated than it used to be
yeah,
from the state's
definitely
level.
more complicated.
Yeah.
Maybe there'd be a legislative history about the new statute that allows for the abolishment. That might tell us what the arguments were
Yeah.
for and against it.
Yeah, I mean, I could follow up with you on that one. Yeah, I could probably figure out, actually, I could look to see when that was authorized, really quick. Let's see. So yeah, it was only added in 2003, which seems like a long time, but relatively speaking, it's not that long. So we don't keep a list of how many towns have had that vote. We know, I definitely gotten a fair amount of questions on it, but we don't usually typically have people follow up and tell us, oh yeah, by the way, we voted to do this. But I know some towns have done it, but like I said, I could, there might be some follow-up that I could provide to you afterwards.
I guess I'd be curious what the listers have to say about it, or the
I got one
consultants.
question.
Yeah.
If the town wanted to have one elected lister and a professional assessor, would the only way to do that be through charter?
So, yes, if you just want one elected lister, what would the assessor's role be? Just like, what would
Well,
the
sort
difference
of like
between-
Brattleboro was doing.
So like, you mean just one person overall, or one lister and one assessor?
You have one elected lister
Yeah.
by the town, and then you have one professional assessor.
And they both perform like the same function essentially?
And they both could be Similar to what we have now, actually.
Yeah.
Here.
So you could do, you could do that by governance charter.
Is that the only way?
Yeah,
the
that's
charter.
the only way to
That's
do
what I
that.
understand.
Because otherwise, it's three
That's
listers.
complicated to
You
get
need to
charter.
have three listers.
Right.
By state law.
Yeah, by state law. That's a
It's
default
not-
state
it's
law.
not-
You know, one or two
And then you
issue
have the
thing
governance
that's-
charter that can modify that.
Yeah.
So.
That's,
Yeah, so like,
that's
you
something
know,
we gotta think
Brattleboro,
about.
again, for example, they have, theirs modifies it so that there's one town assessor and then three listers who don't do what listers typically do, except they hear and adjudicate all appeals.
And my ideal in that
Yeah.
is to have someone that's in the town, that's a resident of town, has a connection to the town, and also a professional.
Yeah.
The best
So you could
of
have a
all.
governance charter that says a single professional certified person, but who is also a resident, for instance.
In your model, who would be superior, how to break ties, or who would be governing the office?
It
The
would be
resident
similar
or
to
the,
what we're doing right now.
the resident or the professional?
They'd be equal,
Okay.
yeah. It would be
Yeah,
similar to what we're
if
doing
they
now.
both had the same authority, you'd probably want to have a third person
Mhm.
Yeah,
because
I think so, yeah, you can't have
you
too
either
like
want one
that.
or three, I would say.
Yeah.
Because
You probably
if you
need
had
two
That
listers.
makes
two
sense,
have
yeah.
the same authority, then if they both disagree, you're not
You're
gonna
locking
get
heads.
Yeah.
You're doing that.
That's true.
That's why you wouldn't want to have like 4 select board members. for
No.
example.
First thing you have to put together a charter before you can change this system that we're.
Yeah,
If you want to go to
If you wanna go that way.
combination of lister and assessor,
Right.
you don't need that if you simply want to abolish the
Abolish it.
lister's office. That can be done at town meeting.
yeah, that's option 3. That's the green option on your thing. So with that one, that can happen without a charter. That can be a town vote,
Right.
and that eliminates the office of listers, and then you can appoint a single person. Well, the select board has to appoint someone, because you gotta have someone in the job.
Either way, the whole town needs to sound off, whether through
Right.
a town meeting vote or through a
the
charter.
Correct. Both charter having different than these 3,
Yeah.
or this one eliminating it, would both have, require a town vote at some point.
And this can be done either at our oral meeting, or does it have to be done by a paper ballot?
The elimination one would have to be a paper ballot at
At
the
the-
floor. It's different. So there's floor vote, by voice vote. There's paper ballot, which occurs at your voice vote. You just have a little
Yep.
Separation of
separate
the
area,
house.
but it happens at your floor meeting. And then there's Australian ballot voting, which is a different kind. So this would be a paper ballot at your.
I believe they use a checklist too at that time.
They do.
You use a checklist at that time, you're handed a yes or no, then you go up and you cast your ballot.
Yeah.
Two questions. One, just to follow up on that, the town of Wallingford had for a number of years, they had hired a contract assessor who did most of the day-to-day work and still had an elected board of 3 listers.
Mhm.
And I assume that was legal. They did it for quite a number of years. So that's still one option that Pittsford could do.
Yeah, that
You
would
could
be.
hire an assessor and still have your board of listers. The only, I don't know how much of a problem that would be if you didn't have the interest and only had, say, 1 lister who wanted the job, and then you're in the same boat that you're in.
Yes,
now.
Also a budgetary matter,
Yeah.
paying an assessor and 3 listers.
But the flip side of that is if you've got the assessor, which you're paying a much
Higher
higher
rate.
pay scale, you really don't want them dealing with the
Overriding.
public and using up a
Yeah.
lot of their time. You want them doing the nuts and bolts. With the listers, they could kind of be the in-between. They'd have the knowledge they needed, but kind of be the in-between, and obviously you aren't paying them anywhere near as much as you'd be paying the assessor.
It
So
worked
there's
very
that.
well when I was in Wallingford for the first two years, I guess, that I was there. We had a board of listers and I was the contract assessor. And, they weren't there every week or on any regular schedule, but any decision-making, I'd bring them in and we'd have a meeting and they would sign the grand list, they would hold listers' grievance. They were really helpful for local knowledge when it came time to do building inspections and driving around and, having another person to bounce that off was helpful. But they didn't work on a day-to-day
Right.
basis. That would have kind of been overkill for most towns, I think, with the size of them.
Yeah.
They would,
hours did you put in?
Did I put in? 4 to 6 typically,
So it's
you know,
not-
a little more during, but Wallingford's a
Small.
little bit smaller than Pittsford, not
A
a lot.
lot.
When it came to grievance.
It's a little bit more
Board
during
of-
the grand list, yeah, filing the grand list, it would always be a couple of 8-hour days then, you know, maybe a couple of weeks.
If it were to come to some grievance hearings, the Board of Elected Listers would probably have to be involved with that.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, they
Absolutely.
absolutely held the
They're the jury.
grievances.
Okay.
The only problem that we had with it was one of them was very involved on a regular basis
Yeah,
and
that's
two of
right.
them were not, so there was a lot of bringing them up to speed when it came time to grievance, but I mean, that was a good and a bad thing. They were kind of like another level of the BCA where they were somewhat impartial. So I presented the town's evidence, the appellant presented their evidence, so, you know, it worked.
Makes
You
sense,
know, there are
yeah.
different ways to get this done. I had another question, if you don't mind. You mentioned the appraiser list. I tried to pull it up on my phone, and after painstakingly typing it into my phone, it wouldn't launch on my phone, so I couldn't check that. I'm wondering whether, the last I knew, there's a approved firms list, there's a project supervisor list, and then there's an
Yeah.
appraiser list, and then there's, I
It
believe, a
might
data
all be
collector
on, I
list.
feel like I looked at this.
I think you're right.
Are one of these that I can connect to or no?
Yeah.
Wi-Fi?
2.4 or 5G?
I've got a 5, another 5. Should come up with a 5.
I don't wanna.
I've got the Wi-Fi address on the door there if you want.
Oh, that's the,
Yeah. Password, I guess.
yeah.
Yeah,
The reason I ask is I'm aware that with townwide reappraisals, when you're hiring an appraisal firm, the towns are usually, I didn't know they were compelled, they're usually encouraged by PVR to use that list. But I wasn't aware of that for assessors, and I'm not sure how many towns are
So-
using that model.
It says, the only time it says that to have to be professionally qualified, yada yada, is under that, you eliminated them and you had to appoint a single person. It talks about expert assistance when you're doing the like help. I don't know if that also means they have to be certified, because you do have the other one I talked about where it says no firm, corporation, or person shall help a town unless they're qualified and certified, so. I think that PVR would maybe be the source, the better source there. What the heck? Did I not click right now? Oh, no, I went to another one. Here we go. Just try this.
Well, you mentioned Nemrick, and they would be on the
Yeah.
approved firm list, but not all of their employees would be approved and certified to serve as assessors. Some of them may be, but, so they're individual lists. My company's on the approved firm list, and I'm also on the project supervisor list.
So those are important
I should
details.
be.
I'm sure.
So this is also,
Whew.
yeah. You're there?
Yes,
Good,
I am,
good, okay,
yes.
Yeah, so
So
I,
that's firms, that's
You're on the
firms.
other list too. I
And
saw
with
that.
those firms, they have to have an approved project supervisor
Yeah.
to be on that list.
Right.
yeah, so that's a good detail.
We'd
Just
probably
like
double
practical
or triple
experience that I
check it with
don't know.
PVR before we went forward.
Yeah, and they'd probably update this every once in a while, so it might not be exactly current, even though this is what they're showing.
I can tell you a few of
Depending-
them have
October
retired. Quite a few of them have retired.
That's part of the problem,
Gone
right?
out of the business.
Yeah.
San Souci only does utility appraisals.
So I think
It
Nemrick does
isn't that
do a-
long when it comes
When it
down
comes
down
down
to
to it.
choosing someone. Towns that have gone out to bid for any of these don't have a lot of choices.
That's what happened during the reassessment in
Yeah,
2016.
The other thing, kind of interesting thing, is that the state, you might be aware the state's doing that RFP to kind of revamp their whole way that the listers kind of do their appraisal reporting and how that flows through to the state. And I don't know, what's going to happen right now, because right now it's through Nemrick, I believe, and I'm sure Nemrick's going to be bidding on that. But we'll see what happens if that really throws towns for a loop, because that might require more resources to kind of have people learn that new system, whatever it's going to be.
If the state can screw it up, it will.
Yeah. But we have that every year. It's just, Montpelier gives us something every year.
Oh,
Gives everybody
If they
something.
can mesh up, they will.
So
Yeah,
Donna,
exactly.
you've been a lister and now a consultant. Do you have any
Yeah, some of them
things
always-
you'd like to recommend about a way forward?
Well, I kind of like the idea of having a certified assessor and then a lister also. I think that's a good way to go with this town. Lisa said the model worked, and you don't have to hire the certified appraiser. That, you know, if you're doing 6 hours a week, and you've got that flow in the office going, you know, the way you want it, we can really maintain those records. And then when it comes time for the grievance, we've got that person there. And then the other thing I was thinking of too, like I know Barry Keefe out of Rutland City. So when he does his inspections, he's out on his own. And I know best practice is to have at least 2 people do inspections.
Yeah, in
So
terms of,
I
because
just wondered,
you're worried about ex parte communication. But yeah,
Or
Rutland
liability.
is a charter and they,
Or somebody accusing you of this bad
yeah, you
behavior?
Oh, yeah,
said
that-
this and you said that, and
It's really nice to have someone.
yeah, Rutland's
It is.
they have a charter that says
Okay.
he is the single, whoever is a single assessor, and that's why they have a single person. So I guess going back to your idea about one lister elected and then one professional assessor.
There's
you-
still only 2 of
You
those.
could do that, but you
Well,
wouldn't
you gotta
want to
have
have,
two-
again, that
two
to have the
listers.
same
Two
story.
listers,
Two
yeah,
elected
yeah.
and
You
an
could say,
assessor.
the assessor, professional assessor shall do the appraisals, and then you could have the lister be the, authority of, the final say. You would have that single person say, okay, I know you're supposed to help me, but under this charter, I'm the one that finalized it. That, in that way, you can kind of work with one and one. But
I think it's really nice to have some accountability, no matter who it is, because there's nobody that's humanly infallible. But I also think that Lisa was just saying that some of these appraisal companies also require you to use their software systems so that their towns they do are all using the same thing, which would require a big change installing.
And some of them on that list aren't gonna be able to help you with NEMRIC, which is a lot of the job of a listing office,
Yeah.
so.
All of our stuff goes through.
Yeah, that largely speaks to townwide reappraisals, so if you hire Vision, they aren't, that I know of, they aren't doing regular assessing services on an ongoing basis anywhere. They're just doing townwide reappraisal services, so
Can we use
you gotta
someone?
have somebody in town
Can
who
we use
knows
that? Can we use-
how to continue on with the Vision program as well as knowing the NEMRIC program and all the rules and regulations of,
The state.
I mean, I could go through that list and tell you
Who's-
who knows some of that and who doesn't, and they don't all know that. The state has been working on that with their, Vermont Property Assessor certification. That gives more of the lister certification. I'm almost on that list.
Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, everyone on that list has to be professionally certified by the state, right?
What they are is they have to have a project supervisor, they have to have done so many hours, it's all in the lister
Yeah,
handback
right,
book, so don't
exactly.
quote me to the exact part of it,
But there is a criteria.
yes, to be
certified.
a project supervisor, to do townwide reappraisal, you have to have
Right.
taken the 3 approaches to value classes. You have to have had so many hours working with a supervising appraiser, doing a townwide reappraisal and having full involvement
Yeah.
with that, so.
Lister handbook, by the way, that's the middle link right there. So if you want to peruse through that, it's not
Yeah.
light reading.
I'll vouch for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was hearing that from some other town that had gotten an assessor, and I guess, I don't know what happened to the listers, I don't know if they just left or they made a decision not to, but, there was an appraiser, an assessor there, and didn't know anything about NIMRIC or Vision. And I was like, so if you're an assessor, how would you do the job if you still don't know NIMRIC and Vision? Those are the, an assessing software system and NIMRIC are the tools you use to get your values to the state and to do your tax bills. So if you don't know how to do that or put them in accurately, you could have a big problem.
Yeah, so that's certainly something you could, ask the person, whoever you're.
When you're hiring.
When you're hiring, yeah.
if you're sending out.
What town was that?
Yeah.
Up north, I think. I could look that up and see how they're doing it.
Sounds like malpractice in terms of the board's action.
I would think.
Well, I think the part of the problem seems to be sometimes is there are 3 or 4 pieces you need to make the whole to work for the town. From my point of view, sometimes it looks like that. Because if they have one knowledge and a skill in one thing, but they don't have any of the rest of them, then you've still got to spend a lot of money, either for them to get training, and you're gonna have that period in between where you've gotta have them needing to put stuff in the computer or the NIMRIC system, and if they don't know how, then how are they gonna do that? If they don't already have experience with those.
Not
There's
easy.
a lot of towns that don't have, like she was saying, one or the other.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that, with what Linda's saying. An ideal candidate would have appraisal experience, would be able to take an appeal all the way through to court with those kind of qualifications. You aren't gonna
Yes.
find that with a lot of listers and a lot of assessors.
No.
But at that level, you can outsource that part of it. But the other parts of it, of the basics of appraising and valuing the property, and then using the tools to put that in the system, and then all of the legalities of being a lister, and that's the part that is kind of missing from some of these firms that do just the townwide reappraisals. They don't know all the nuts and bolts of that, and that's a lot to learn. I started out with just doing the townwide reappraisals, and you know, sometimes it was kind of nice to ride out of town after the job was done. There's a lot that happens every day after that.
Any other questions? Board members, any questions? John, you all set? Any other questions? Everybody?
So if you have questions, you know, if you think of something, right, when you're sleeping tonight, hopefully you're not thinking about it when you're sleeping tonight, but if something pops in your head, you can email me or call.
Yeah.
Yeah, it might be me answering, it might be Garrett or Susan answering, so.
All right. Well, we thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very informative, so.
Had a pretty drive through.
Which way did you
I
come?
was coming from Montpelier, so I did 89 to 4.
To 4 and up over
And then through Meadow or something, or
Meadow Lake Drive?
Yeah.
GPS,
Yeah.
yeah.
that was
7. Yeah, it's a nice drive.
Watch out for deer and stuff.
Oh, yeah, they're out.
For sure.
Well, thank you for coming down, we appreciate it. Huh? No, we've still got some,
One more item on the
we got
agenda.
another item on the agenda.
Maybe the listeners will stay for that. It's the
You don't hear
admission.
it? We have, yeah.
Yeah, he is, so the charter is. So yeah.
We're gonna go back
I was
home.
gonna say, I did take a shower, so.
She was getting cozy up here. So who's got the,
We're gonna move on, Donna and Carl, I'm sorry, to our
Yep.
next item, if you don't mind.
hello,
We can have a
Donna?
conversation in the hallway, maybe.
We're still in meeting.
So, yeah, Mr. Chairman, we have an
Yes.
error and omission submitted by Lisa and Nick, and it has to do with 2 parcels. First one is parcel 1392, located at Arch Street. The owner purchased the parcel in March of 2019 in a foreclosure sale for $40,000. Reportedly, prior to the purchase, the owner had discussed the lousy condition of the property before the key date, which was April 1st, 2019. That's the valuation drop dead date. While there was no written record of these communications, it seems to be pretty clear that several members of the town staff did have conversations with him about it. So we should be presumed to know that as of April 1st. And given that, the listers have the opinion that this was an error to not adjust the value of the property. If this error and omission is approved, the listers will send the change of assessment notice to the owner, which will allow them to grieve the new value with 14 days' notice. So they're hoping to take the original value and reduce it by $108,900 to a new value of $198,700.
And that was the property where they did receive a grievance.
This is the Larson
The
project.
Larson,
Okay, so they did receive.
Not a grievance, a
Not a
change of
grievance, a
assessment
change.
notice. I wasn't aware of this because.
I
the-
found it today.
oh, you found it.
Oh, so we
Well,
have new
the reason they
information?
received that is a long-standing policy the Pittsford listers have had, which is, it's not customary, but they had the
It's a
right to make
courtesy.
that decision. As a courtesy, any property that transfers, they've been sending them a change of assessment notice. So he got, in effect, the kind of engraved notice to grieve, and I
That's how
wasn't
our
aware
grievance
of that. So he could have brought that in within 14 days of that notice, and I wasn't aware of that until yesterday when I
Lisa-
spoke with
yeah,
Donna.
Lisa had
so-
called me, and so
For
today.
So,
Linda-
so where does this error and omission
So-
stand? Do you want to move forward with it or not?
Or,
I mean, everybody, I'll tell you, when they miss that grievance period, we have said you're gonna have to wait till the following year, which is fair. That's pretty, set in stone. That's the way it goes, because once you let it go for one person,
well, yeah, set
So would the
precedence.
listers like to withdraw that error?
You wanna
and
withdraw
omission?
this?
We've got all three members of the team
This is the
here.
property that they're tearing down?
I was in.
I
guess I'm a little confused. It's the one they tore the back off of, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, there are two issues. While he could have grieved it, there is still the point that the listers do have an obligation and a right every year to inspect any property that they believe has changed, either in the town's favor or in the taxpayer's favor, to inspect that as of the condition of it as of April 1st. And the listers didn't do this even though they were notified of that. They may have thought that would be handled with a grievance and suggested to Mr. Larson that he did that. So an argument could be made in either way for this one, Donna. I just,
Now, is this the property that he's tearing down now,
Yes,
the big
yes,
White House?
yes.
Yeah.
And he did not speak to me or Linda in our office. Apparently, it was July when the tax bill came out, that he started coming in and complaining about it, but that's too late. I mean.
Do you have a copy of that letter so we could all see it?
Oh, yeah, I have, there's a copy in there right now, the date stamped of him getting that change of appraisal and the grievance on the other side of it, yes.
So it was reduced then, or it wasn't?
no, it was
It
not
wasn't,
reduced.
it was not.
No, it
So it
was not
stood at the
reduced. He received a
307,000.
change of assessment notice, just as a courtesy with no actual change.
Okay, all right, I see.
This is something some towns will do. If someone asks, they say, I missed the grievance time last
Well,
year.
we'll change
I'd like to be put on the list to get the notice of when grievances are. Because that's the only time listers are obligated to send an individual notice when they change the value. But they can flag it in Nemrick for them to get a notice, even though they've made no change. I don't know, Nick was just asking whether we ought to discuss it and come back, but we do have the December 30th deadline, so I'm inclined to go ahead with it. And I think, given what I saw of that property, I think I'm suggesting a reasonable decrease in it, and I don't suspect it'll go further. An argument can be made either way, but given that we're into the middle of November almost already, I think I would go ahead with it so we can close it out for this year. And Nick and Linda and I have talked about policies of kind of obligating people to put everything in writing. They don't just come into our office and talk to us. Put it in writing.
Yeah.
Perhaps hear what they want
Yeah,
to hear.
I don't know if we're setting precedents.
You know,
That's my worry.
That's my
We
worry.
had been there in 2018. We had checked out the property.
Lisa and I did make an inspection a couple days ago too. We both went out to the property.
Well, it's definitely at some point gonna change,
I
but
would move that we not go through this, because we would be setting a precedent.
yeah, what's the board's pleasure? Is that a
inclined to
motion?
agree.
I would second that motion. I
So,
think, as long as we've
Yeah, it's
got,
in there.
as long as we've got the paperwork that
Yeah,
showed he was given the option of grieving.
Yeah.
So that we have a motion on the floor and a second. Any further discussion? I'll move it. Joe?
This is what you people kind of think is the right thing to do too, I assume.
This one is a little bit
Because
of
we
a
never
gray
saw
area.
him. And for Linda not to see him coming into our office is unusual. 'Cause he was 1.
The motion is to
The motion is
reject.
to reject,
or-
and
Deny the request.
to reject the request. the board feels you're setting precedents if we do. So that's the motion. It was seconded. Any further
I can
discussion?
live with that, well, his option is.
Well, you can grieve it in a few months.
Yeah. All those in favor?
Next year.
Aye.
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 Those
Aye.
opposed? Unanimous.
Okay, the second has to do with parcel 1079, the estate of Barbara Poljasic. The property was transferred from the estate of Barbara Poljasic to Linda Willis on February 28th, and because that came before the April 1st date of importance, the proposal is to make that change to reflect the new ownership.
Okay.
That's kind of standard procedure.
Yeah,
isn't it?
you know, it's just
So it's just something that
That's
got
just-
missed.
Just
Right.
something that got
Okay.
missed.
I make a motion, we do this.
second.
So,
I'll second it.
motion been made and seconded. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carries.
Okay.
No further business to have? Meeting
For the time being.
adjourned?
I know,
This,
There was
this,
another.
for an hour and a
you
half.
have, whoop,
You know that we brought.
It wasn't an
to your
action
attention
item,
that
it
one?
was an information item, not an action item.
Yeah, I just wanted them to be aware of
Okay,
that.
Sure.
That one, we had
This
to take it.
Next one is Victoria and David Fish at Markowski Road. The explanation, this taxpayer was sent a change of assessment in May of 2019, indicating an increase of their assessment from 121, 100 to 152 and 300 on the preliminary grand list for 2019. The taxpayer came in to the office after grievances to state that an error had been made regarding the specifics of siding and roofing. This correction was made by the listers at the time, and the assessment was reduced to $145,000, and the tax bill was issued accordingly. An error was made by the listers in that a change of assessment notice was not issued by the listers at the time of the subsequent change. In order to comply with this statutory requirement, Lisa Wright recommended, and this was seconded by Nick, that we send an official change of assessment at this time and give the taxpayer opportunity to grieve within the statutory 14 days from the grievance, from that notice to be sent. So that's really not an action item, they're just letting you know of the situation in case there's further consequences.
okay, so we don't usually,
Sounds like you've handled it.
hopefully, yeah.
We had to,
you
do it.
could.
Yeah.
They weren't given the notice that they.
Right, they should have been.
given
Well, yeah.
by
All right, so
law.
that you gotta do.
Yeah.
Yeah. Meeting adjourned.
Don't go beyond.